Thanks for joining us today for a webinar with VCU Alumni called STEMinists, VCU Alumni in Science, a program we organized to celebrate Women's History Month. My name is Dr. Amy Gray-Beck. I'm the Executive Director for Alumni Relations and a proud alumna of the School of Education from 2019. We will be recording this webinar and captioning it and sharing it on our YouTube channel for later viewing, and you can catch all of our previous virtual programs and Q&As on the VCU Alumni YouTube channel. VCU Alumni has been offering a number of virtual lifelong learning and personal and professional development webinars. The next event we have is tomorrow, and it's called What Just Happened. So we're doing a series every month called What Just Happened. Tomorrow it's Sneaker Madness, a look inside the booming sneaker industry. So we have alumni talking about that. So we hope that you will join us for that. Today we have some questions to get us kicked off, in addition to some submitted questions from the registration form. But attendees can put questions in the chat feature or the Q&A feature on the webinar or in Facebook comments, and we will try to get to as many as time permits. Now, to get started, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for this afternoon, Dr. Sarah Golding. Dr. Golding received her PhD from the University of West of England, Bristol in the UK in 2006. She did her postdoctoral training in the laboratory of Dr. Christophe Valery in the Department of Radiation Oncology here at VCU's Massey Cancer Center, and she is a molecular biologist by training. Dr. Golding joined the VCU Department of Biology in 2011 as the Director of Undergraduate Research. Sarah since has focused on promoting undergraduate research and other experiential learning experiences at VCU. Sarah is deeply committed to supporting inclusion in STEM careers. She is the undergraduate program director for the VCU initiative to maximize student development, the co-program director of the VCU Bridges to the Baccalaureate program, and on the leadership team of the VCU Howard Hughes Medical Institute Inclusive Excellence Program. Incredibly busy, so we really appreciate your time today, Dr. Golding. Welcome and thank you for moderating our alumni panel today.
Oh, no worries. It's always fun to do these kind of things. These are the fun events. So today we have some excellent alumni working in STEM joining us from all over the world. In fact, we have somebody chiming in a little later who has some time difference issues, which is just kind of indication of our modern world, right? I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers today, but Amy will be pasting their full bios into the chat box if you want to read a little bit more about them. So first we have Dr. Tiffany Roll. Tiffany's actually a former student of mine, so this is always exciting. Dr. Roll graduated at VCU with a forensic science degree in 2012, and she currently serves as an education and engagement fellow at the National Institute of Health and the American Society for Human Genetics in Maryland. Actually, I didn't say where she graduated. She got her PhD from Baylor College of Medicine, sorry. Dr. Roll participated in a postdoctoral research education program at Case Western University and then pursued her doctorate degree in genetics and genomics. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Roll.
Hello.
Next, we have Dr. Elisa Ward. Dr. Ward received her degree in psychology from George Washington and then received 2 degrees from VCU, a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology. She completed her residency at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and fellowships at both the University of Hawaii and the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Ward currently serves as a behavioral health and clinical director at the Department of Medical Assistance Services, overseeing all aspects of policy and regulation related to the Virginia Medicaid Behavioral Health Program. Next on our panel, we have Micah Risk. Micah studied health, physical education, and exercise science at VCU and is joining us today from Boston. As a Penn State scholar, Micah worked at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. She then went on to study at Tufts University Friedman School, where she earned a master's degree in food policy and applied nutrition, with a focus on nutrition interventions and urban agriculture. She is the head of nutrition and the founder of Lighter, a software-based food as medicine company with an all-female founded team. Micah, thanks for joining us today. Last but not least, and someone you won't see until a little bit later, is Dr. Salma Omer. Dr. Omer received her BS in chemistry from VCU in 2015. She graduated with a PhD in neuroscience from Vanderbilt University in 2020. Salma is currently completing a research fellowship at Vertex Pharmaceuticals in Oxford, the United Kingdom, And because she's joining us from overseas, there was a little time change today, and she will be joining us halfway through, but we look forward to welcoming her when she does. So I have a few questions to get us kicked off, but at any time you can put questions into the chat and we will get to those questions later in our program. So I'm going to start off with how far have we come in equal gender representation in STEM? In your view, why is this important? I'm going to ask one of you to unmute.
I have unmuted.
Go on, Alyssa, sorry.
Well, we have come quite a ways in terms of psychological sciences. We have seen, increasing numbers of women as, faculty in academic programs. We've seen some progress towards wage gap closing, but even I think the last assessment was 2010, women in the psychological sciences were making 78 cents for every dollar made by their male peers. So that gap is still in place. And then when we look at kind of faculty in this context, full professors are made up of 46% of men, only 28% of full professor ranks. As assessed last, I think this is 2013, or I'm sorry. Yes, I'm looking at APA's data. 2013, 28% of full professors were women. And, that gap that we see in professorship is, driven by a lot of factors, but some that we were discussing before the actual panel began in terms of the timing of when women come into their the completion of their doctoral degree and the start of the faculty and tenure process, and how that lines up with them potentially starting their own families, and when women, how women try to fit into that process, the rest of the process of their lives. So these are, there's some evidence that we've moved forward, but we still have a far way to go.
I think to also piggyback on that, what we see in genetics is that there may be differences. I think for sure it's still a male dominant field, but when we look at genetic counselors, we do see there is a large increase of women that are in genetic counselors. And so that is very important because these are the people who are communicating potential genetic changes that will occur in the family or after cancer diagnosis. But I think that gender representation is very important in STEM because we're beginning having women at the seat of the table women are able to ask questions that are related to women's health, potentially prenatal care. And so those questions present a different lens, especially if the person is passionate or personally affected by those questions or research topics.
Yeah, the space, I work kind of in two spaces. One is the nutrition dietetic space, and then in the food innovation startup space. And I see big differences between the two. First, in the nutrition and dietetics, it's primarily women. In grad school, it was I think 90% of the student body were women, primarily white women as well. So, there's more to go into in terms of representation beyond that. But in the startup space and in the innovation space, there's a profound gender bias that I've come up against many times. And in preparation for this, I was looking at some funding data in the venture capital space. And differences between funding for male and female founded companies. And it's really sad. So I'll share a couple stats. One, increase for female founded teams from venture capital was increased eightfold from 2010 to 2019. But in 2019, less than 3% of venture capital funds went to female founded companies, less than 3%. And then when we looked at data from 2020, that actually reduced, which is really unfortunate. Of course, there are fewer female founded companies compared to male founded companies. So that 3% isn't too shocking, but when you look at them one-to-one, you find that VCs do fund less for female founded companies compared to male founded companies on average. And that's despite the performance. Women generally outperforming their male counterparts in this space. A Fidelity study looking at this found that women, female founders, actually outperformed male founders in terms of returns and in savings. And I'll add one little interesting anecdote that they found that men, they tend to have like an illusion of control, which contributes to this kind of overconfidence in a space that's inherently risk-based, which kind of is funny, this illusion of control in a risk-based space. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting, and I'll probably be tailoring some of my answers to that just a little bit more, which hopefully is helpful for this context.
So thinking about the importance of women in these careers, did you all have female role models when you were going through your training, and how important were those female role models to where you are today?
I guess I can start off first. So basically for me in graduate school, I had older graduate students that were women, and they were extremely helpful. I still message them to this day and ask them questions about how I should navigate different situations. But I think having older grad students that were women were able to help me understand some of the cultural norms, especially in a male-dominated department, and as well as understand kind of what are the ways in which you can advance your career and how you can highlight yourself or advocate for yourself in that space, as well as how to matriculate through the program. So it was very helpful for me to have older grad students that were women to kind of help me through the process.
Yeah, I'd say my studies at VCU, my advisor, Dr. Joanne Richardson, was fantastic. And she really set an example for me in terms of just setting the path for yourself, and also not being afraid to stand up for what you believe is right, and even if it's not very popular, but just incorporating that sense of justice in a way in everything that you're doing, especially when you're talking about health. That's really important. And I'd also say other women that are in the space, like my co-founder is a really, really strong individual. And just in general, I find that my female peers are extremely supportive, and leaning on each other in hard times has been really important for any of our success.
Well, I would like to say a word about male mentorship. Both my graduate mentor and my postdoctoral mentor were men. And my mentor was Dr. Michael Southam-Giroux. I want to give him some shout out today, our current chair of the Department of Psychology. And, there's something to be said for good mentorship across gender lines. Good mentors are good mentors. And I can remember conversations because I entered graduate school very young. I was 22. I came straight through, and I was still figuring out a lot about the world, not just about academics or my field of study. I was trying to figure out how to navigate bill payments and my student loans and all of these factors. And Mike really he kept that relationship so protected, and he was such a fantastic mentor to me in terms of it never even really occurred to me the gender dynamics, because he really treated me like family, like I was he just gave me such full respect. But I do actually remember times where he said, I wish I had a woman I could give you right now, when there were issues that came up outside of our mentorship relationship that were about gender, where he often wished, I remember, that he had someone to refer me to. And but my relationships with my male mentors, I credit those as really important experiences that really formed my development as a psychologist. They really formed who I am today. and set me on the path that I am on. I'm still, very close with both of them. But I will acknowledge as well that when I left academia for a period after postdoc and went into community mental health and administration, the CEO of the company that I went to work for was the first woman that I had ever worked for professionally in that way. And she not only was a woman, social worker, but also had lived experience, had a child with serious mental illness. And the thing that really influenced me about this female mentor was that she was so public and open about her lived experience. And I saw the power that had in breaking down stigma about mental health disorders. And it really influenced the way that I began to become a more integrated person and to really speak out about my family's experiences with mental illness and substance use disorder, which really, I think, took me to the next level professionally. So a little bit of each.
So we can all agree that differing perspectives strengthen industries and research outcomes, that gender diversity can contribute to this. Can you share an example or a time when you have seen this come into play, where having gender diversity? So you kind of just mentioned that with the male mentorship and the mentorship across gender lines, but what other strengths have you seen when we are having gender diversity in our teams?
I think a point we can say when we have gender diversity across teams is that I think it provides us with, like Alyssa was mentioning, Dr. Alyssa was mentioning, it's just a perspective. So kind of piggyback off of that statement, having mentors that were males, they helped me or gave me solutions in a way in which they feel would be the best way for them to approach it. And then also having a woman that was a mentor, they would give me a different approach that may or may not be closer to what I felt personally comfortable doing while I faced that challenge. But having a male mentor, having a male perspective kind of gave me, when I walked into the room, what was the dynamic, what was the cultural norm, and what was the behavior that was expected of me. And that was very helpful, because having that, knowing what that expectation was when I faced adversity or when I had to do a presentation, I kind of knew what was the expectation. And my thesis advisor was a woman. And so she was able to tell me, this is the expectation, you can handle it this way or this way. And that made me feel validated, like, oh, okay, I can handle this challenge. I have the tools to accomplish it. And so I feel like when you have those different perspectives and different views, it gives you a holistic view of how to, be a scientist or be accomplished within your field.
I think that having, gender diversity in professional environments allows us to develop insight and process more about the institutional bias that exists and about our personal biases that we hold. And if the room is not diverse, it's very hard to break through or become more aware of how those biases affect our behavior within the professional space. And I can remember I did a lot of traveling with my mentors. At one point, we were training nationally together on some of the treatments that we had all worked together in developing. And we would be out presenting to very large, diverse crowds. And it became clear really early, and it was interesting to process with them things that they could say that I couldn't say, jokes that they could make that would be taken very differently if I made them. Things that would come in, for example, we took a lot of notes and feedback, a lot of evaluation, and we would get evaluations that would comment on my professional attire, on my hair, that they would never have, we never saw a comment about their physical appearance or attire. And so, I think for them, I can't speak for them, but I do remember them saying at the time, like, wow, these are things we've never even thought about before, when it was just the guys. And so it really led, I think, to greater discussion about how we train, the boundaries that we hold, how they would amplify my voice, or how we would have ways where they would make space for me differently. And so I think that and that probably changed the experience for the trainees who were learning about this science. So I think that diversity allows for us to process and work through those biases.
Yeah, I've had a pretty mixed experience. On one hand, like you mentioned, Sarah, I am lucky enough to have, a company that was female founded, and the space and kind of sisterhood that we created there was really warm. And yeah, I'm really proud that we were able to start the company that way. And we used to joke about like hiring our first man and needing some diversity training for when that moment comes. Even our CTO, our first CTO was a woman, which is pretty rare. So on one hand, I have that experience. On the other hand, being out in the startup world and pitching and things like that, we've come across all kinds of situations. And of course, most of the people we've been pitching to for investment or for partnership have been men for the most part, probably like 80% or so. And we've heard some of the comments that Alyssa was just sharing. And like there was one time we were at a pitch competition, and at the end of it, the investor asked me like how I got my hair so shiny, and I was totally caught off guard by that, and just I had no idea what to say. I was insulted and shocked, and yeah, it just felt so silly and so uncalled for. And there have been many other instances of unfortunate situations like that. Unfortunately for him, we knew the organizer of this event, who was a male, and who organizes a lot of the events in this space. So we were able to talk to him and say, hey, you can't tolerate this type of behavior in this space. And that investor was removed from future events. So, I think, of course, the diversity is really important. And part of doing that means holding male leaders accountable. Ideally from a preventative space, not reactionary, because I think sometimes we react too late, but thinking about how to prevent that kind of behavior from the get-go, and encouraging male leaders to set the right tone, because their male colleagues are going to be looking to them for that type of guidance.
So science careers have traditionally perceived as hard and long hours and extra work. How do you think about incorporating being a mother into that world? I know I have an 11-year-old, and I've been a full-time working parent since 2010. And some days that means I go to work on 3 hours sleep and give a lecture. Or I've also led meetings with a kid that's been dismissed from class in the corner of the room under the threat of do not speak. But for me, that was very much like, it was an important part of who I was, to be seen as a working mom. But I wondered if you guys could comment.
Well, I'll go first. I have a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old who, for the first 6 months of the pandemic, were both here full time with me. During a time when at Virginia Medicaid, we were taking on an incredible amount of work related to the pandemic response and just the healthcare system in general. And so I kind of think of the intersection of motherhood and work in pre-COVID times versus COVID times. And I actually think that I'm coming to a different point a year into this, where I'm able to appreciate some of the resiliency that's been gleaned, at least for me, from this experience. And I know that it's not, so I don't speak universally, just from my own personal experience of it, that I never imagined being one or the other. I always knew, for me personally, that I wanted to be a mother. I wanted that experience. And I also wanted to be a psychologist. And I actually originally wanted to be a physician. And I wanted these careers. And it never occurred to me that they couldn't happen at the same time. Not that I had particular models of that. I just was going to do it. I was going to make it happen. And I think, though, that once you get into the realness of it, the biggest challenge is, I think for us as a culture, is that before COVID, I didn't feel a real safety in the integration of those two identities. I felt like I had to be Dr. Alyssa at work, and then I had to be, mom at home, and that somehow I had to find the time for all of those, and they could not intermix. And one of the resiliencies I have found in COVID is that my life has been, in some ways turned upside down, but in some ways fully knit together and integrated. I am that same person. When I am presenting, most of the time, children are running in and out of this room. That includes recorded events, that includes addresses to hundreds of people. And there, I have chosen to do that without a virtual background in my instance as a really mindful choice to be very visible about my experience and to never apologize for the presence of my children, and to demonstrate to people that this can be done. It may not always look the way it used to look, but that encouraging my mostly female staff to do the same and to put out there that having an integrated self is and really pushing that as a gender is good for both men and women, and good for policy reform in terms of how we expect people to integrate those identities in the workplace going forward.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I love that, Alyssa. Everything you shared is really inspiring, and I think this question is really valid. At the same time, I never hear this question asked of men, so just want to note that. But it's really valid, because a lot of the work, both at home, at home, still does generally fall on the mother, and many of the child rearing generally falls on the mother still, despite wanting to lift women up in their careers. So it's really valid, and I think, personally, I've been able to use it for in favor of my work, or to benefit my work, because I have 2 children, and working in food and nutrition, many of the food purchasing power still is in the mother's or the wife's hands, and that's pretty general statement, but it does tend to be true still. And so understanding consumers' needs, understanding families' needs from that perspective, I've been able to incorporate it into my work, and I think make our product and our services far more effective. Really, really valid question, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because it's a challenging one to navigate. There's no hiding that. But you started off asking this question. These fields are challenging and long and hard, but women are, especially mothers, are well equipped for that. We've been trained well.
But I would also like to say I am not a mother, but I think that this conversation is very important. And in COVID, I appreciate people who are mothers, who are leading the example of seeing, like, merging those 2 lives together. And we kind of mentioned this before the panel, but in grad school, most people sometimes will say you can't have kids in grad school because you're not able to do both. And so we're starting to see women able to have their personal life as well as their professional life, and think about these topics. And I think it's more accepted. And I think it's important that we're honest with people as they try to pursue these careers, that you can be both, and that it is acceptable. Or if you choose not to have kids, kind of like Micah mentioned, most guys don't mention whether they have children or not. And so I feel like it opens the space for people to make that decision from themselves, and not have to feel pressure for making the decision to be a mother or be or not. So
I think as we look to the COVID year, though, there's probably a lot more men who are much more aware of how their days go, depending on what their wives' jobs were this year, because some men have been thrown into being the person at home who is responsible for looking after the child because the mother had an essential worker status or something like that. So, maybe what comes out of a disaster is some change that we desperately needed, with some leveling of the expectations in the home. So I think you've probably all seen that Salma Omer has joined us here. So we're excited to have Salma on. I'm going to move on, kind of jumping off that COVID. We've talked a little bit about it, but not just COVID, other times, but there are tough and uncertain times. And what has sustained your work during those times and helped you overcome challenges?
Is this question targeted to me, Sarah? Sorry.
You can go ahead if you want. When I ask the question, if you just want to unmute yourself, I'll see who unmutes first. But you go ahead, Salma, because I know you had a big change this year.
I did. Hi, everyone. It's so good to meet you all and just be surrounded by so many powerful and inspiring women. I apologize for jumping in late. There's the time change hasn't taken place in the UK yet, so it kind of threw me off a little bit for this week. But yeah, so as Sarah alluded, I definitely, my life has, turned upside down, like many of us, for some instances for the better, and in some cases I would rather not have certain changes happen to me. But I transitioned from academia, so I did my PhD at Vanderbilt, and then transitioned into an industry role here in the UK. There are many things that COVID has definitely made things a lot more different, considering that I transitioned from very different environments. And I think for me, the biggest challenge this year has been, like everyone probably, is just forming new relationships, and those organic relationships that would have been formed otherwise in a new setting, in a new role, over, just virtually. And I have been in this role for 7 months, and it still feels like I have been a part of the company for not that long, or the relationships that I have, I think, aren't as maybe in depth as they would have been otherwise. And I don't know if that answered, part of your question, Sarah, at all, but I'll stop going on a monologue and give a chance for the other panelists to chime in.
So the question, go ahead, Tiffany.
So I think it's like sustaining during hard times. So I think that, like we mentioned, working in STEM is challenging, and I definitely faced many challenges in grad school. But I think the most important thing that kind of kept my why was, having a spiritual background. So I'm using faith as a way to help me understand kind of some of those challenges. But I think the biggest thing is, everyone says, what is your why? And mine was kind of like, why not? Like, okay, yes, I'm a Black female. Obviously, we see it, but why not? Why can't I be a scientist? Why do we have to keep seeing the same stories? Like, why not? Okay, my opinion is different. Why can't we have a different opinion? Why does it always have to be the same thing? And I guess it really bothered my parents as a kid, because I was definitely like, why? And so I think kind of flipping that response, like, what is your why? And mine was, why not? I don't know anyone who else is a scientist, so why not me? Why don't I become a scientist? So those type of things kind of keep you going. And I think understanding that you're going to be different, and just accepting that and living in that truth, I think helps sustain you. And COVID is something that's unexpected, but I think it really teaches you that it's always going to be something. Like, graduating in COVID is not optimal. The job market is hard, but I think you kind of get to the point you're just like, okay, well, I've accomplished that, check it off the list. Now let's fight for another day, and so graduate school kind of teaches you that.
I'll go. I think what has sustained me most has been relationships, and I actually see some of those relationships represented in the attendees today, which is really wonderful and heartening. You know, one of the things about science, a doctoral experience being so arduous is, you know, in psychology and in many other fields, you're moving around a lot. So, you know, there's graduate school, but then there was internship, residency, you know, there's fellowship, there were postdoc positions, there's all these transitions. But I found that in all of those different places that I lived and different positions I was in, I developed these relationships, you know, specifically with other women who, many of them other psychologists, who then we've kind of created this community where online, where I have this, you know, really easy way to access them that is really beautiful for my everyday resilience, from anything from talking through work, you know, work decisions and advocacy to creative ways to manage my kids or Dr. Risk, even like how to feed my kids. You know, there's so many ways that I access those resources every day, and they get me through each day. And then the sustainment of my mentorship relationships has been really important to me during the times where I have doubt, knowing that my mentors have supported and believed in me, and that I can still turn to them. But I think too, going off of what Tiffany was saying, there's also the meaning aspect of it. So I have found that in working so hard for this career that I have and developing my identity, which I'll always be developing as a psychologist, I just, I feel so lucky to derive the amount of meaning that I do from the work that I do, and have such a wonderful team of women, including an amazing female supervisor, my deputy, who kind of share that meaning and that mission and the work that we do. And that makes a big difference in sustaining through the hard times.
Yeah, I think my mind is just going to some of the kind of cliches, but I think they're really true. One is that progress is not linear and success isn't just a straight line. And failure is to be expected, or mistakes are to be expected. That's how we all learn. So, you know, the hardship is a given, no matter who you are. And, you know, getting back up on the horse, it's true. It's going to happen over and over and over again. But that's okay. And it happens to everyone, even those who act like it doesn't. It happens to them too. And then on top of that, I think going back to what was said earlier about the why, the mission is really, really important. And I think anyone who is working in the sciences is working for something that's bigger than themselves. And at the same time, we're individuals who are showing up, you know, we're all humans that are showing up to do this work. So tapping into that mission, that why, to keep going day after day is really important. But you know, forgiving yourself too, if you need to take a day off, if you need a mental health day, and encouraging your staff or your employers to support you in that. And there's a lot of data on productivity that lines up with mental health support, or being able to take a walk or a brain break, or take care of your kids, or whatever it is that those do make you better humans, better people, and better workers, you know, to use a kind of an unfortunate word. Yeah, so I think it's helpful.
So I'm going to move on to some questions that we had submitted both during registration and then during the chat. And one of the first questions is from Henzie from Yorktown, VA, and Nicola from Ashland. Says, do you ever feel imposter syndrome, and how can you overcome it? I can't help but share my biggest imposter syndrome moment. And for those of you who have taken cell biology, which is probably a fair amount if we've got a lot of cell scientists in here, I actually was walking into a lecture of 300 students and had to Google what is RNA polymerase before I gave a lecture on translation. For those who aren't cell biologists, RNA polymerase is an essential enzyme that's absolutely essential to translation. And if you have studied in the sciences, you learn that in freshman biology. And I was walking into my lecture, and it's just that mind blank that happens sometimes. And you suddenly are like, why am I the person standing in front of these people giving this lecture? And I knew it. I knew it through and through. I knew the whole lecture without even looking at my notes. But that moment that my mind went blank. What examples have you all got?
Oh man, I have so many. I think I've accepted that imposter syndrome is going to be a part of my personality and my life going forward. And like you said, I mean, there are things where I am the expert in, and I know that I'm an expert in that, you know, especially since I have recently transitioned into a new role, being in a new environment, having new tools to use. You know, I told myself, well, I don't know how to use this. And I convinced myself that I don't know what I'm doing, and you know, I don't deserve to be here. And that, just hearing myself say that out loud is I almost want to laugh at myself, because, you know, it's something that I have battled with my entire life. And as a woman of color, and, you know, maybe women in general can relate to this, we have to try almost 10 times or 100 times as hard to prove ourselves in the workplace. And so given that fact, I have to remind myself continuously that I am worthy. I do deserve to be here. I have tried 10 times harder than whoever. And it's an internal battle that I have with myself, to be quite frank. And I mean, that is my story of my imposter syndrome. But yeah, it's there. And no matter how successful I am, no matter how ahead I am of in the field I am, I you know, I can say that I continue to battle with it over and over again as I transition into new roles.
Yeah, I think, sorry, do you want to go ahead? It's probably best if you have the last word on this. You're probably going to be able to break it down in a really interesting way for us, probably more academic. I'll say for myself, imposter syndrome, yes, across the board, it's happened 1,000 times. The way I've been able to reposition it for myself is thinking of myself as a learner and just being really open to learning. And I think with that comes the kind of forgiveness to yourself for not knowing everything, not having all the experiences that other people have in the room, and hoping that others are bringing themselves to the conversation as learners as well. You know, with that coming the humility and openness that I think is required for like really good conversations and collaboration. But just trying to replace that label in my head with, you know, I'm a learner and I'm trying to do better and be better and bring what I have to the table, and what I don't bring with me, let's find someone else that has that and not pretend that I should have it all, right? No one should have every skill or experience.
I think for me, similar to the other panelists, you know, when you transition into a new position, you're always like, you know, how can I be the best? Am I really worthy of being in this position? And, you know, I think having a supportive environment, as well as having colleagues or community that can really, when you're doubting yourself in those moments, remind you of all of your accomplishments. And then also just reminding yourself of just kind of patting yourself on the back and having that list of like, oh, I did this today. You know, obviously, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but, you know, I've accomplished something, I've done something. So I think that really helps you to kind of figure out what your next steps are. And really kind of build upon and build that community with others, as well as having the open conversation. I think when other people say, oh yeah, I also feel, I don't know about this. I feel like it's like, oh, wow, okay, we're all the same. You know, it brings a community common bond. So that works as well.
I'll try to do the summary. What I think is interesting about imposter syndrome is that when we experience it, it's usually about this comparison to others, what they hold, that what we don't perceive ourselves to have, which is usually about knowledgeability or reputation or experience or power, right? And how, we often feel, I don't have these things, so how can I operate in this space without those kind of tools? And I feel like my imposter syndrome has, I feel like this should be It Gets Better commercial or something. I feel like it's gotten better over age. But mainly, I think from the experience of realizing that often I don't have those things. I don't have the power or the expertise or the knowledgeability. That's valid, that I'm going to enter spaces, especially when you reach a certain point or certain level in your career, where you're just going to be with people who have a lot of experience outside of your own. And that my job is not to bring what they bring, it's to bring what I bring. And that I may not always, for example, translating my work in psychological science and working as faculty and moving into policy and regulation, there's a lot I don't know about policy and regulation. But I remember a conversation again with my mentor when I made this jump, and me expressing imposter syndrome to him, this doubt, like, can I do this job? And he looked at me and he said, Alyssa, if not you, who? Who is this person that's going to be better at doing this job? And I think that what I learned in the mix of it is that I might not know these things or have this power of authority, but maybe I bring humor or humility or compassion or that learner's mind, that curiosity. And maybe that's the strength that I bring, because I know at this point I can learn the stuff. With time, I'll learn the content. But maybe the strength I'm bringing before I master that content are those other characteristics that are going to bring me value in that space and earn me respect, as I'm catching up on content. So, I think that's an important thing. Remember what you do bring in the face of the comparison of what you don't have.
I love that. We now have two catchphrases. What, why not? And if not you, who? So this one is quite a long question, but it was submitted by one of our people who's listening in right now. So Katrina asks, what advice do the panelists have for students in navigating the student-faculty power dynamic and also similar power dynamics in the workforce? Particularly, in which ways can we empower ourselves to reach our goals and be our whole selves in our career? And the question suggests maybe thinking about systemic barriers females and people with other marginalized identities have experienced, race, LGBTQ, disabled, etc. That was quite long. Do you guys feel like you got it, or do you need me to read it again?
I guess I could, based on my personal experience, I could share what I found helpful. Find your allies. For me, that was the most powerful thing I could do during my PhD. Find your allies in especially in places of power in terms of hierarchy. There will be people that will go to bat for you, not just verbally, because there will be times, very difficult times, given the power dynamic that I, in general, for instance, might have felt powerless and I couldn't do anything about certain situations and I needed to act on them. But those allies were able to go to bat for me And I mean, there are countless times that came into effect. And honestly, the reason why my resilience, a lot of it, came from that. My power to push through, just having that support, not just, your family support or whatever you find that helps you get through, on a day-to-day basis. But for me, it was also finding someone on the inside or multiple people on the inside that will be my, will serve as my support to help me power through.
I'll say, I think in society, especially like over the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of big changes in terms of like analyzing and breaking down the systems and exposing the injustices, the discrimination, et cetera, for what they are and where they come from, and how we built this system to be where we are today. And in doing that, there are a lot of openings, I think, in various organizations, and granted to various degrees within organizations, to point out and identify when that's happening or when that's occurring or where that system exists. I think we have new language now and more shared knowledge and language around those systems and how they surface and how they're harmful. So we have opportunities to point them out and to encourage building, either rebuilding infrastructure or building in systems that help us, build like maybe two steps ahead. So I spoke earlier about holding our male colleagues or male leaders accountable. I think one way to do that is not just by talking about gender diversity or making sure that enough women are in the room, but making sure that we have representation across the board, proper representation in all of the discussions and all the advisory boards, the board of directors, the meetings that we're in, the focus groups we're designing, the data that we're collecting. We're looking for representation and diversity in all of those, because just by virtue of having representation there, we're drowning out the white male dominated system. And we're then able to build from something more equitable. So I'd say that's one way that I would do it, and look for opportunities in either your space in school if you're still studying, or throughout your career. I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that now. I'm just looking back at the question. I want to make sure I don't overlook something important. Empower ourselves.
I'm going to move us on just because we have a couple more questions
Sure.
in the chat for people who are actually listening. And so perhaps we can just get some quick answers before we time out. What ways can the work environment help support a working mother? We need to be quick.
Flexibility in schedules, in hours, in the way that we do the work. We can get the work done. We just need both men and women need more flexibility in how we get the work done.
Okay.
I just second that.
Yeah, I third that. How do we encourage more girls, women to pursue STEM careers given the gender career expectations and challenges they're still facing?
I think the main thing is to encourage people is that like diversity is good, and even how cheesy some people may make it sound, like I want to hear your voice, I want a new opinion, I want the new thoughts. I think it's innovative, and so that's why we need you in STEM.
Yeah, I think the world literally depends on representation and science, in science and science. So I talk to my 12-year-old daughter all the time about the problems in the world and climate change, et cetera. The problem and the solution is in science. Yeah.
I'd like to say that I'm currently, for the next generation, I'm currently breaking barriers to make it easier for you. So we need you.
I think I may be able to squeeze in one more question, and that is, One short answer, how did you get interested in science? When was your first memory of being interested in science?
I was kind of a hipster dipster kid. I wanted to save the environment and we shouldn't cut down the trees. And so I like bugs and nature. And so that was the start of just saving the world.
I was cutting up my Barbies. This is not my serial killer tendencies. I was cutting up my Barbies to understand how the knees were and the joints were bending. And that's how it started for me.
Yeah, I'll just say when I learned about the overlap of the food system and its impacts on the environment and health, and I thought this is crazy that it's built this way. I have to break this down and rebuild.
I think I've always been interested in human behavior and why people do what they do, and have always had a curiosity about that. And so I picked the perfect career.
Excellent. Well, we are writing just up to time. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks to our moderator, Dr. Sarah Golding, and each of our panelists, Tiffany, Micah, Salma, and Alyssa. I'm feeling incredibly inspired. You couldn't see me, but I was nodding and smiling the whole time and snapping. What you've shared is so powerful, and I'm so grateful that you've shared your experiences, no matter attendees' gender or industry. VCU alumni, faculty, staff, and family members of current students appreciate your expertise and experience you bring to this important and timely topic. Your time is incredibly valuable, as we know and recognize this is a very busy time for you and everyone, so we're grateful for the work that you do, the awareness we can build, and we want to thank you for answering our questions live today. And thank you for our attendees. There were so many great questions submitted and supportive comments in the chat, so I appreciate what an engaging audience you've been. We will be reposting this webinar to Facebook and YouTube with closed captioning for later viewing. We have linked to a survey in the chat box, so we would appreciate if you could complete that, because we truly value your feedback and we always want to continue to do more of what we can do better, continue to keep doing the things that we are doing well. If you've enjoyed listening and learning from graduates of the college, please consider making a gift. The College of Humanities and Sciences relies on the generosity of its alumni and from our community to support its teaching mission, research, and offering great learning opportunities like the one you've enjoyed today. To give, just please visit support.vcu.edu/give/humanities and sciences. Thanks again for our fabulous alumni panel, and we will see you soon. Go Rams!